Have you ever stopped to wonder how the rain that waters the crops in your own country actually gets there? We tend to think of rain as something that just forms locally, drops water, and moves on. We take for granted that the weather systems deciding if our local farms have a good year or a bad year will just keep functioning like clockwork. But those systems exist because of a massive biological engine pumping water into the sky thousands of miles away. And right now, that engine is under extreme pressure. The real answer to how this all works together might surprise you more than you would expect. So let's dig into this together. Think about the weather app on your phone. You check it to see if you need an umbrella, or if a storm is coming later in the week. We treat weather like it is just something that happens to us, a random roll of the dice from the atmosphere. But if you didn't already know, the Earth's weather isn't random at all. It is a highly connected machine. And one of the biggest, most important parts of that machine is a forest that covers a massive chunk of South America. When most of us think of the Amazon, we picture nature documentaries. We think of brightly colored tree frogs, jaguars walking through the mist, and endless green canopies. We think of it as a beautiful, distant place that has nothing to do with our daily lives. But the Amazon is not just a pretty backdrop. It is a literal piece of global infrastructure. It regulates how water moves around the entire planet. The trees there are essentially billions of massive straws, pulling water from the dirt and sweating it out into the air. The Amazon releases enough water vapor into the atmosphere every single day to create its own weather system. That weather system creates flying rivers in the sky that water crops thousands of miles away. Remove the forest, and the rain doesn't just stop over the jungle. It stops over places that never even see a tree. We usually picture the loss of this rainforest as a slow, tragic thing. A background issue that takes centuries, something mostly for future generations to worry about. We see pictures of logging trucks or fires on the news and think, well, it is terrible. But it is happening so gradually that nature will surely adapt. But what if it wasn't gradual? What if a shift happened not over 300 years, but over 10? A single decade. 10 years is almost nothing. 10 years ago, you probably remember exactly where you lived and what you were doing. It feels like a blink of an eye. Now imagine watching the largest living system on dry land completely unravel in that exact same amount of time. We take for granted that the natural systems keeping us alive are simply too big to fail. We look at the ocean, or the sky, or a forest the size of an entire continent, and we think they are permanent fixtures of the Earth. But they aren't permanent at all. They are just balanced. And balance is incredibly fragile. Think about your body's own immune system as one long, complex chain. Pull one important link out, and the whole chain weakens. A natural environment works the exact same way. It is a vast network of plants, animals, and weather patterns that depend on each other so tightly that pulling on one string can unravel the whole sweater. The trees didn't just stand there. They were holding the global climate up. The idea of this massive, wet, vibrant jungle turning into dry scrubland in just 10 years sounds impossible. But the physical rules that would make it happen are already sitting right there, waiting for the wrong kind of push. Once that limit is crossed, you do not get a warning alarm. You just get a shift in the wind. And eventually, that shifted wind would reach your own hometown, changing the food on your plate and the water in your glass. When we learn about the water cycle in elementary school, we get a very simple picture. The sun heats the ocean, water goes up, clouds move over land, rain falls, and rivers take it back to the sea. And for a lot of the world, that's basically how it works. But the Amazon is so massive that it doesn't just participate in the water cycle, it hijacks it. If the Amazon had to rely only on moisture blowing in from the Atlantic Ocean, half of it would be a dry savanna right now. The ocean just can't provide enough water to keep an area the size of the contiguous United States completely soaked year-round. So, how does it survive? It creates its own rain. Every single tree in the Amazon is actively pulling water up through its roots and sweating it out through its leaves. It's a natural process some call transpiration, but really, it's just a forest breathing out vapor. A single large tree can release hundreds of gallons of water into the air in just one day. Now multiply that by nearly 400 billion trees. The sheer volume of water they pump into the sky is staggering. The forest isn't just sitting in the rain, it's actively making it. This moisture rises up, cools down, and forms heavy rain clouds. It rains back down on the forest, the roots drink it up again, and the trees sweat it right back out. It's an endless relay race of water. The exact same water molecules get recycled over and over, up to 6 times, as the weather system moves from the Atlantic coast deep into the heart of the South American continent. It's a self-sustaining engine. The trees need the rain to survive, but the rain only exists because the trees are there to make it. And that's exactly where the terrifying fragility of this whole system hides. Because it's a closed loop, it's incredibly efficient. But closed loops have a massive weakness. If you break the chain, the loop doesn't just slow down, it collapses. When you understand that the forest creates its own rain, you start to see why removing trees isn't just about losing some wood or some animal habitats. Every time a patch of forest is cleared, whether it's for cattle, grazing, or farming, you aren't just removing trees, you're removing water pumps. You're turning off the engine one piece at a time. For decades, we've been chipping away at the edges of the Amazon. We treat it like an infinite resource, assuming that as long as there's still a lot of green left on the map, the engine will keep running. And for a long time, the forest has compensated. It's absorbed the damage and kept the moisture cycling. But a biological system is a lot like a rubber band. You can stretch it, and it seems completely fine right up until the exact millisecond it snaps. We're approaching the point where there simply won't be enough trees left to sustain the rain cycle. If enough of those water pumps are removed, the remaining trees won't be able to generate the heavy clouds needed to water the rest of the forest. The rain won't just decrease. It will fail to reach the deeper interior at all. And once that interior stops getting rain, those trees will dry out and die, which means even fewer water pumps, which means even less rain. It builds on itself. The system goes into reverse. Scientists have a term for the exact moment a natural system like this breaks. They call it a tipping point. But that phrase gets thrown around so much on the news that it kind of loses its meaning. We tend to think of a tipping point as a warning sign, like a flashing red light telling us we need to turn back before it is too late. But that isn't how nature works. A tipping point isn't a warning. It is the moment when a small change suddenly triggers a massive, unstoppable shift. It is the moment you push a boulder just 1 inch too far over the top of a hill. You can't pull it back. Gravity takes over. For the Amazon, we used to think that to destroy it, we would literally have to cut down every single tree. We thought we had until the very last acre was cleared before the system truly died. But we don't. We only have to remove enough of the forest to break that closed loop of rain we talked about. Computer models have looked at this closely, and they suggest the line is somewhere around 20 to 25% of the forest being cleared. Once you hit that number, the water pumps simply can't generate enough moisture to keep the rest of the jungle wet. And right now, we are hovering near 17%. We are standing right on the edge of the line. If we cross it, the change wouldn't look like a gradual thinning. It would look like a sudden, violent flip. The first thing that happens is the dry season gets just a little bit longer. A few extra weeks without rain doesn't sound like much to you or me. But to a tightly packed jungle that has spent millions of years relying on a daily soaking, it is a death sentence. The largest, oldest trees, the ones that pump the most water, are the most vulnerable. Their deep roots suck the soil dry trying to survive, and when there is nothing left, they die and drop their leaves. This opens up a hole in the thick green canopy that usually acts like a giant umbrella. Suddenly, harsh, direct sunlight hits the forest floor for the first time in centuries. The dark, damp dirt bakes in the sun. The dead leaves turn into dry tinder. And then, something that almost never happens naturally in a healthy rainforest becomes the biggest threat of all. The forest stops being a sponge and becomes fuel. Once fires start in a dried-out rainforest, the system begins to feed on itself. This is what researchers call a feedback loop, which just means a change that causes more of itself, speeding up the more it happens. A fire burns a stretch of trees. Those dead trees can no longer pump water into the sky. Less water in the sky means less rain. Less rain means the surrounding trees dry out even faster, which means the next fire will be even bigger. The cycle spins faster and faster, completely out of our control. This is exactly how you lose an ecosystem the size of a continent in a single decade. Not by chopping it all down, but by pushing the dominoes until they fall on their own. Once that tipping point is crossed, human logging becomes completely irrelevant. We could pack up every chainsaw and bulldozer and leave South America completely, and it wouldn't matter. The forest would already be destroying itself. The green engine runs in reverse, tearing itself apart from the inside out. But when the Amazon burns, it isn't just releasing smoke. It is releasing something that will eventually change the sky over your own house. When the fires really take hold, they don't look like the massive 100-foot walls of flame you might see on the news during a wildfire in California or Australia. Rainforest fires are actually sneaky. They creep along the ground, just a few feet high, slowly burning through decades of dead leaves and rotting logs. You could easily step right over one, but that low, slow burn is completely devastating to a system that has zero natural defense against fire. The trees in the Amazon have incredibly thin bark because they never needed protection from heat, so even a small, slow fire cooks the living tissue just under the bark, and the tree quietly bleeds to death over the next few weeks. When one part of a natural system breaks, it doesn't just affect the thing that broke. It pulls everything connected to it down with it. And in nature, almost everything is connected to almost everything else. Think about the sheer volume of life we're talking about here. 10% of all the known species on Earth live in this one forest. Millions of insects, thousands of birds, frogs that exist on exactly one specific type of tree, and mammals that only eat one specific type of fruit. When those deep-rooted trees die and the canopy vanishes, the giant green umbrella collapses. The shade is suddenly gone. The temperature on the forest floor spikes by over 10 degrees. The damp, dark world turns into a dry, blindingly bright oven. The first things to go are the insects. We usually think of bugs as just annoying, but they are the absolute foundation of the entire animal kingdom. They recycle the dead wood, they pollinate the plants, and they are the main food source for almost everything else. When the ground bakes, the insect populations simply crash. Without bugs, the frogs and small lizards starve. Without them, the monkeys, birds, and snakes have nothing to eat. Without the birds to eat fruit and spread seeds, new plants can't grow. It's like a game of Jenga that nature has been playing for millions of years. Some of the pieces we're pulling out right now are the ones near the very bottom. And it isn't just the land that changes. The Amazon River is the largest river by volume in the world. It holds a fifth of all the fresh liquid water on the surface of our planet. But the river only stays full because the surrounding forest acts like a giant continent-sized sponge. It catches the heavy rain and releases it slowly into the streams over months. When the trees die, that sponge disappears. And the soil bakes hard like concrete. So when rain does manage to fall, it doesn't soak in. It flash floods, washing millions of tons of dirt and ash straight into the rivers. The water chokes. The fish and the completely unique river dolphins suddenly find themselves in shallow, muddy, overheated water that can barely hold oxygen. If you've ever been to a truly wild place, you know that healthy nature is incredibly loud. It hums, it buzzes, it screeches. As the cascade accelerates, that noise just stops. Within a few short years, the vibrant, deafening noise of the deep jungle fades out, replaced by the dry sound of wind blowing through dead branches. The sheer amount of life simply evaporates. But nature doesn't keep its disasters contained behind borders. What happens in the jungle doesn't stay in the jungle. Because as all that life dies, the massive biological water pump we talked about completely shuts down. And that's when the problem leaves South America and comes looking for the rest of us. When that massive biological water pump shuts down, the consequences don't just stay in South America. They travel along the exact same paths the water used to take. Remember those flying rivers we talked about earlier? The ones the trees create by sweating vapor into the sky? Those rivers of air don't just hover over the jungle. The wind pushes them west until they hit the Andes Mountains, which act like a giant continent-sized wall. The clouds bounce off the mountains and are channeled straight south, directly over the biggest farming regions in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. For thousands of years, those regions have relied on that invisible river in the sky to water their crops. It is the only reason those massive plains are fertile enough to grow food instead of being dry dust bowls. But without the forest pumping water into the air, that sky river just dries up. The rains simply stop arriving. And here is where the problem reaches your own kitchen. If you live in North America, or Europe, or Asia, it is really easy to look at a map and think that a drought in Brazil is a local tragedy that won't really affect your daily life. But the modern world doesn't work like that anymore. We built our entire global food supply on the assumption that certain places would always produce massive amounts of food. South America is one of the biggest agricultural engines on Earth. They produce a huge percentage of the world's soybeans, corn, sugar, coffee, and beef. Think about the food you bought at the grocery store this week. Even if it was grown locally, it is tied to that global engine. Most of the meat eaten around the world is raised on feed that relies heavily on those South American crops. When the rain stops and those massive farms turn into cracked dirt, the global supply of basic calories plummets. When supply drops, panic buying starts on an international level. The price of almost every basic food staple skyrockets practically overnight. A loaf of bread or a pound of chicken suddenly costs twice as much, then 3 times as much. For wealthy countries, it means painful inflation and empty shelves. For poorer countries, it means immediate, devastating starvation. The food on your table tonight passed through a chain of thousands of species, weather systems, and soil conditions you've never seen. Remove one massive link, and the chain doesn't just weaken. It breaks in ways that take decades to understand and longer to repair. But it isn't just about what we eat. It is about how people live. Almost the entire continent of South America runs on electricity generated by massive dams that catch all that heavy, tropical rain. When the flying rivers disappear, the rivers on the ground start to shrink. The lakes behind the dams drain out until they are just muddy puddles. The giant turbines stop spinning, and suddenly, some of the biggest cities in the world, places with tens of millions of people, simply go dark. And without power, they also lose their ability to pump drinking water. Imagine living in a modern city like Sao Paulo, a place with skyscrapers and subways, and turning on your tap to find nothing but a hollow hiss of air. The reservoirs that supply water to millions of people rely completely on the moisture generated by trees hundreds of miles away. When the trees die, the taps run dry. You suddenly have tens of millions of people without food, without power, and without safe drinking water. People can't stay in a city that can't give them a glass of water, so they have to move. The collapse of the forest forces one of the largest sudden human migrations in recorded history. Millions of desperate people moving across borders, looking for a place where the rain still falls. The rain didn't just move to another country, it stopped existing entirely. When we break something big, our immediate human instinct is to think we can just fix it. We're builders, after all. We look at a dying forest and think, well, we'll just stop cutting it down. We'll pass international laws, we'll ground the bulldozers, and we'll plant new trees. We have massive tree planting campaigns all over the world already. We assume nature is like a scraped knee. If you just stop picking at it, it'll eventually heal on its own. But a rainforest doesn't work like a scraped knee. It works like a complex mechanical watch. If you smash the gears, you can't just throw all the pieces back into a box and wait for it to start ticking again. The biggest misunderstanding about the Amazon is what lies beneath it. Because the jungle is so incredibly green and dense, we naturally assume the dirt underneath all those trees must be the richest, most fertile soil on the planet. But it isn't. The dirt in the Amazon is actually surprisingly terrible. It's acidic, thin, and almost completely stripped of nutrients. So how does the biggest forest on Earth grow in terrible dirt? Because the forest doesn't actually live in the soil. It lives on top of it. Almost all the nutrients in the Amazon are locked up in the living things themselves. The trees, the plants, the animals, and the millions of insects. When a leaf falls or a tree dies, it doesn't just sit there. Millions of bugs and microscopic fungi break it down immediately, and the living roots suck those nutrients right back up, before they ever really enter the deep dirt. The entire jungle is just one giant, incredibly fast recycling machine. When the fires sweep through and the big trees die, that recycling machine stops. The ash from the burned trees sits on the surface. And when those heavy, violent flash floods come because there are no roots left to hold the water, all of that ash and all of those remaining nutrients get washed straight into the rivers and out to sea. What's left behind isn't soil. It's effectively baked clay. You can't plant a rainforest in a desert. If we wanted to reverse the damage, we couldn't just drop seeds from an airplane. We'd have to somehow replace the millions of tons of topsoil that washed away. We'd have to recreate the microscopic web of fungi that connects the roots together and acts like an underground internet, sharing food and water between the trees. That underground web takes thousands of years to build, and a low-ground fire cooks it out of existence in a single afternoon. And even if we somehow managed to engineer the soil and hand-plant billions of saplings, we'd run into the biggest wall of all. The rain is gone. Remember the closed loop? The trees make the rain, and the rain grows the trees. You can't grow new trees without the daily rain, and you can't get the daily rain back without fully grown, deep-rooted trees pumping water into the sky. It's a lock with the key locked inside it. Once it snaps shut, you can't open it from the outside. The system doesn't just lose its trees, it loses its physical memory of how to grow them. This is why 10 years is enough to make the change permanent. We'd spend the first 5 years arguing about whether it was really happening. By the time the massive international panic set in and the rescue funds were released, the topsoil would already be in the ocean. The land wouldn't just be empty. It would be fundamentally altered. And what takes over when a wet forest dies isn't just a blank slate. It's an entirely different kind of nature, one that completely changes how the whole planet breathes. If you were to step into a rocket 10 years after the tipping point and look down at South America from orbit, the map of the Earth would literally look wrong. We are so used to seeing that massive, dark green shape stretching across the center of the continent. It is one of the defining features of our blue marble. But in this new world, that deep green is mostly gone. In its place is a vast, pale expanse of brown, yellow, and dusty gray. It would look like someone took a giant eraser to the equator. The green didn't just fade, it was deleted. What replaces the rainforest isn't a desert completely empty of life. It is something called a degraded savanna. Imagine endless miles of dry, brittle grass scattered with a few tough, fire-resistant shrubs and thin trees that can survive for months without a drop of rain. It is a harsh, quiet landscape. The towering canopies that used to block out the sun and house millions of unique living things are replaced by an open, baked plain. And the rivers that used to snake through the jungle like massive brown veins are mostly dry, cracked ravines, only filling up with muddy flash floods during the short, violent rainy season. But the real shock isn't what the land looks like. It is what happened to the air. To understand this, you have to think about what a tree actually is. We tend to think trees just pull material out of the dirt to grow. But trees are actually built mostly out of thin air. They breathe in the invisible carbon floating in the atmosphere, strip out the oxygen for us to breathe, and use the solid carbon to build their trunks, branches, and leaves. They are basically giant, living storage tanks for carbon. And the Amazon was the biggest storage tank on dry land. When billions of trees burn or die and rot over a single decade, all of that stored carbon doesn't just vanish. It goes right back into the sky. The amount of carbon locked in the Amazon is roughly equal to 10 full years of every car, factory, and power plant on Earth running at maximum capacity. Releasing all of that in just a few short years is like throwing gasoline on a fire that is already burning. The invisible blanket of gas that traps the sun's heat around our planet suddenly gets much thicker. The global temperature doesn't just creep up, it jerks upward. And that sudden spike in heat messes with the global wind patterns that drive the weather everywhere else. The jet streams, those fast-moving rivers of air high up in the sky that push storms and seasons around the globe, start to wobble and break down. This means the weather stops acting normally in places that never even saw a rainforest. Farmers in the American Midwest suddenly face completely unpredictable freezing springs and boiling summers. The monsoon rains in India, which provide water for over 1 billion people to grow their food, might arrive months late or sometimes not at all. The entire planet's atmospheric rhythm loses its timing. You start to realize that the forest wasn't just a quiet place sitting in the background. It was the anchor keeping the Earth's climate steady. Without it, the whole boat is just drifting, and that leaves us facing a reality that most people aren't ready to accept. We are conditioned to expect global events to look a certain way. We watch movies where the disaster is sudden, obvious, and undeniable. A giant wave hits a city, or an asteroid strikes the ocean, and immediately, all of humanity sets aside their differences to fix the problem. We think the collapse of the planet's largest ecosystem would feel like a massive earthquake. We assume there would be a loud, global alarm bell ringing, clearly enough for absolutely everyone to hear it. But nature doesn't have an alarm bell. When an entire continent-sized forest starts to die, it doesn't happen with a sudden explosion. It happens quietly, day by day. From our busy human perspective, it just looks like a string of bad news. The first year, the dry season is just a little hotter. The news mentions a few more fires than usual, but we have seen fires before, so we just scroll past it on our phones. The second year, the price of coffee and beef goes up a few cents, and we blame the economy. The third year, a major South American city has to start rationing its drinking water, but to someone living in London or Tokyo or Chicago, that just sounds like a distant infrastructure problem. We are incredibly good at normalizing small changes. We wake up, look out the window, and assume the way the world looks today is just how it has always been. So the real question isn't whether we have the technology or the money to stop the forest from disappearing. The real question is whether we would even agree that the tipping point had been crossed before the window to act was completely slammed shut. And the uncomfortable, honest answer is that we probably wouldn't. We would spend the first 5 years of that single, crucial decade arguing over the data. We would debate whether the massive droughts were just a temporary weather cycle. We would form global committees to study the lack of rain, and we would draft international treaties, setting hopeful goals for 20 years in the future. But the physical rules of the Earth do not care about our treaties. They do not wait for us to finish debating. By the time the reality of the situation became so obvious that absolutely no one could deny it, by the time the global food supply severely fractured, and the massive human migrations had begun, the biological engine would already be broken. The flying rivers of moisture would be permanently gone, the delicate topsoil would be washed into the ocean, and billions of tons of stored carbon would be heating the atmosphere. We would finally be completely ready to act, desperately looking for a way to put the pieces back together. We would be staring at an empty puzzle board. This is the most terrifying part of watching a massive natural system unravel. It isn't just the physical destruction itself. It is the stark realization that our fast human timescale and nature's deep timescale are completely mismatched. We only react to things that happen in days or weeks. But a forest that took 50 million years to carefully build its own self-sustaining rain cycle operates on a completely different clock. When its clock finally runs out, it doesn't give us a clear countdown timer. It just simply stops ticking. And once it stops, the illusion that we are somehow separate from nature shatters completely. We are forced to step into a new era, trying to survive on a planet that has suddenly lost one of its most vital organs. Living in the aftermath of a massive ecological collapse wouldn't feel like a post-apocalyptic movie. You wouldn't be wandering through a wasteland fighting off scavengers. It would just feel incredibly, constantly exhausting. Think about going to your local grocery store a few years after the system breaks. The aisles would look mostly the same, but the prices of everything tied to global agriculture would be permanently sky high. Things like coffee, chocolate, beef, and soybeans wouldn't just be expensive, They would be luxury items. Even basic bread and pasta would cost a huge percentage of your paycheck because the reliable rain seasons that farmers around the world depended on for centuries are gone. The global food engine would be sputtering, and you would feel the pinch every single time you scanned an item at the register. You would check your weather app, and the predictions would be practically useless. Without the steadying anchor of the massive rainforest pumping predictable moisture into the air, the global jet streams would become completely erratic. One year, your hometown might get buried under an unprecedented blizzard in late spring. The next year, you might face a punishing drought that dries up your local reservoirs and forces water rationing in a place that has never lacked water before. The baseline of what we consider normal weather would be gone. You would be living on a planet that is essentially sweating, trying to regulate its temperature without its primary cooling system. And the losses wouldn't just be in your kitchen or in the sky. Think about the medicines in your bathroom cabinet. A huge percentage of our modern medical breakthroughs came from observing how strange plants, fungi, and insects in the deep jungle defended themselves against disease. When the forest burns and turns into a dry savanna, we don't just lose the trees and the rain. We permanently burn down the largest, oldest biological library on Earth. We lose potential cures for diseases we haven't even encountered yet, simply because the unique tree frog or rare vine that produced the vital chemical went completely extinct before anyone ever documented it. But the inconvenience of expensive coffee and weird weather is nothing compared to what would be happening near the equator. Millions of people who used to rely on the consistent rain for their farms and the massive rivers to power their electrical grids would be forced to leave. Entire modern cities that literally ran out of drinking water would become hollowed-out ghost towns. The borders of neighboring countries would be severely strained as millions of climate refugees move north and south, desperately looking for places where the water cycle still functions. The geopolitical map of the world would shift, driven entirely by the ghost of a forest that used to pump water into the sky. If you were to stand right in the middle of South America a decade after the tipping point, the physical reality of the loss would be overwhelming. The rich, damp smell of wet earth and millions of blooming flowers would be replaced by the dry, metallic scent of baked dust and old ash. The ground, which used to be a spongy, deep mat of living roots and soil, would be hard and cracked, dotted with tough, scrubby bushes that offer almost no shade. The temperature would be brutally hot, the sun beating down without the massive green canopy to block it. But the most striking change wouldn't be what you see. It would be what you hear. A healthy rainforest is deafening. It is a constant, overlapping roar of millions of insects, birds, frogs, and monkeys communicating all at once. In the aftermath, that roar is completely gone, reduced to the sound of dry wind moving across the flat, cracked dirt. You realize that the Earth didn't die. The planet itself is completely fine. It just adapted to a new, harsher reality. But it adapted in a way that left us with far less room to survive. We eventually get used to the new normal, because that's just what human beings do. We adapt to the empty spaces. We learn to budget for groceries that cost 3 times what they used to, and we stop expecting the weather to make any logical sense. We build bigger water tanks, we engineer tougher seeds, and we pour concrete walls to hold back the unpredictable flash floods. We survive the transition, but survival is a very different thing from living on a planet that actively supports you. Within 20 years, the maps hanging in elementary school classrooms all over the world get reprinted. The massive, dark green shape that used to dominate the center of South America is quietly replaced with a pale, dusty yellow. Kids growing up in this new era will trace their fingers over those tan stretches of land, memorizing the names of dry ravines and scrubland plains. When they watch old nature documentaries, they'll see footage of endless emerald canopies, rivers so wide they look like oceans, and a sheer explosion of life that seems completely impossible. To them, the rainforest will just be a myth. It'll feel exactly like looking at pictures of dinosaurs. And eventually, one of those kids is going to ask you a question. They'll ask what it was actually like to live in a world that had a beating green heart that massive. They'll ask how something so enormous, a biological engine so powerful that it created its own flying rivers and watered entire continents, could just vanish in a single decade. You'll have to look at them and explain that we didn't actually cut down every single tree. We didn't pave over the jungle with bulldozers. You'll have to explain that we just chipped away at the edges, pulling out invisible threads, totally convinced that the system was too big to ever truly fail. We pushed just enough dominoes to cross a line we couldn't see, and then we just had to stand back and watch the rest fall on their own. That's the real tragedy of losing a system this large. It isn't just the loss of the water, or the animals, or the predictable seasons. It's the crushing realization that we fundamentally misunderstood our place on the Earth. For centuries, we walked around acting like we were the engineers standing outside the machine, deciding how it should run. We thought we were the operators, but we weren't. We were just one tiny, fragile part sitting deep inside the gears, completely dependent on the motion of the whole. When you break the biggest gear in the machine, the whole factory changes. You can't put the pieces back in the box and start over. The Earth simply shifts into a new, harder state, and we're forced to carve out a life in whatever space is left. We learn to live without the flying rivers. We learn to live with the heat. But the hardest thing to get used to won't be the empty sky or the baked dirt. This is a hypothetical scenario. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict. It's the silence where the lungs of the world used to breathe.